It's absolutely a pleasure to see you all in this wonderful morning. Good morning to all of you once again. And this is not going to be a formal, ceremonial kind of thing that we'll be experiencing for the next few minutes. This is a very informal, interactive session, right? So, as E.H. Carr in his What is History tells us, history is a continuous process of interaction between past and present and an unending dialogue between historians and their facts. And similarly, R.G. Collingwood in his book Idea of History clearly demonstrates that every new generation must rewrite history in their own way. Every historian should not be satisfied by answering to old questions. Every historian, therefore, should ask new questions. So, as a student of history, keeping these two historical figures, E.H. Carr and R.G. Collingwood, I have 5 questions to ask. Question number 1. Can Marxists be nationalists? Question number 2. If the Marxist cannot simply be a nationalist, how does one accept the Marxist interpretation that nationalism in India is a 19th century phenomenon? Question number 3. How did Panikkar's experiential epistemology invalidate Marxist interpretation of nationalism? Question number 4. To what extent the politics of proselytization in colonial India strengthened Panikkar's decolonization idea? And finally, did the Indian National Congress create what the polymath Panikkar would call denationalized patriots? So I'll just try to have a brief conversation with you. As I already told you, history is a continuous process of interaction between past and present. So whatever I say or I share may not be necessarily the final word. So we are here to discuss, deliberate, dissent, and disagree. So the first question, can Marxists be nationalists? I'm sure Marxist historiography in India has its foundation on the premise of the theoretical framework set by Eric Hobsbawm, a British Marxist historian. Interestingly, Eric Hobsbawm is being portrayed as the great historian of modern Europe by none other than historian Romila Thapar herself. So the discussion therefore is not about who says what. The actual discussion is about how Eric Hobsbawm's Marxist theoretical framework is being applied in the Indian context without subjecting it to critical scrutiny. So let me make it a little more clear. A recent study on Eric Hobsbawm's nationalism uses a phrase, it's not mine, rootless cosmopolitan. So for Eric Hobsbawm, nationalism is not necessary. He doesn't like the idea of nationalism. Very interestingly, in his letter to left-wing historian in 1988, I quote, he says, I remain in the curious position of disliking distrusting, disapproving, and fearing nationalism wherever it exists. It cannot be a nationalist discourse. And he says finally, I cannot be a nationalist, and any Marxist can never be a nationalist. This is self-explanatory. Maybe as historians, all of us, you can think what exactly the framework set by Eric Hobsbawm is being used again and again without subjecting it to critical scrutiny. Now the next question, in continuation of this, I find it very interesting. If the Marxist cannot simply be a nationalist in the language of Eric Hobsbawm, how do you as a historian, and I myself as a student of history, would be able to accept the Marxist interpretation that nationalism in India is a 19th century phenomenon? So here comes polymath Panikkar and the idea of what he calls integral Indian nationalism. What do I mean exactly by the word integral Indian nationalism, and how Panikkar interprets it? I find personally there are more similarities than differences between R.K. Mukherjee and K.M. Panikkar. So he challenges the Eurocentric and Marxist interpretation of nationalism, and he says the Rig Veda, one of the oldest literary records of humanity, reveals how the rishis, who were believed to be the organizers of Hindu political culture, made conscious attempts to transform the motherland into a living deity. Furthermore, Panikkar argues how the sacred unity of the homeland was strengthened through the chief places of pilgrimage in India. Most notably, I'm sure all of us are aware of it, Haridwar, Banaras, Puri, Rameshwaram and Dwarka. He is also of the view that the unity was not only religious one, I would like to underline here, the unity was not only religious one but was also political. On the sacred network and religious unity of India, K.M. Panikkar further says, I quote, India was thus mapped by holy places, and although these lay far apart from each other, the practice of making pilgrimages from one another give them a religious unity. The land was covered by a sacred network, and this made the land itself one in all its distances, in all its diversity, and one and indivisible, unquote. So it is in this context Panikkar asserts that even the land was torn by hundreds wars, its unity continues to exist. And very interesting observation he makes. The unity among the people, which moved perhaps Akbar during the medieval times to seek for a new religious synthesis. And secondly, he says, it is this unity among the people compelled Aurangzeb to slow down his southern expeditions. And what is exactly he is trying to tell us? The unity that was brought among Indians by the British in the 19th century, according to Panikkar, was merely one phase of work. Now, as Marxist scholars would often claim that there was no idea of India, India was unified by the British, therefore doesn't hold any truth at all, according to K.M. Panikkar. So accordingly, nationalism in India is neither the 19th century invention nor an imitation of what you would call Western fashion. Rather, it is a deep-rooted Indian phenomenon. The third question: how did Panikkar's experiential epistemology invalidate Marxist interpretation of nationalism? It's very important. I'm sure all of us must have gone through his book, Western Dominance in Asia. He studies in Oxford from 1914 to 1918, then comes back to India. Then he teaches history at Aligarh Muslim University, and he leaves his job immediately after Gandhi's imprisonment due to his non-cooperation movement, and subsequently he joins the national movement. It is significant, therefore, that his painstaking work on Western dominance in Asia, perhaps one of the earliest works on colonialism, seemed to have originated in 1925 itself, when he visits Portugal and visited the port from which Vasco da Gama had set sail for India. Standing on the small port, I would request all of you to visualize, standing on the small port, he imaginatively say the tremendous waves of changes they had created and they had carried with them, the impact of Vasco da Gama. Just visualize it. See, it was on that day, one of the biographers of K.M. Panikkar, Tara Shankar Banerjee, says, Panikkar felt like writing a complete history of the rise of European domination in Asia. This anti-colonial ideology, therefore, seemed to have chased him for, remember, 25 years. And the fruition of his hard labor during those years was in the publication of what we all cherish, Asia and Western Dominance in 1953. And I'm so happy that we are also including his book as part of the essential reading. So next question is, did the politics of proselytization in colonial India embolden Panikkar's idea of decolonization? And he is perhaps one of the earliest scholars to challenge the missionary politics immediately after the Portuguese invasion. So expanding the non-Eurocentric school of thought, Panikkar argues that ever since the arrival of Portuguese missionaries in India in the 16th century, Christianity has been an arm of Western imperialism. He indicates that the Portuguese Captain General Vasco da Gama's ship had a large cross of Christ along with cannons as a symbol of a new power entering the East. It reveals, therefore, that the Portuguese had dual aspirations: political expansion and dissemination of religious ideas. So the Portuguese rulers, therefore, as well as the missionary proselytization, continue to engage in a material as well as spiritual conquest as a way of consolidating their political dominance in India. And therefore, it's very important. This leads to another important question, right? According to him, particularly Eric Hobsbawm, Marxists cannot be nationalists. Now the question which he encounters, what was the role played by Indian National Congress, particularly what we often see them as moderates? It's very interesting, I find it here. Did the Indian National Congress create what he calls denationalized patriots? What he exactly means? Panikkar is of the view that the leaders of the Indian National Congress, most notably W.C. Banerjee, Dadabhai Naoroji, and a few others, were known for their what he calls denationalized patriotism. Why? Why the Congress leaders had to be identified as denationalized patriots? He has a very interesting answer. He says, these leaders were largely men of what he calls Western culture, dominated by, again what he says, Western ideals. This hardly we see in any textbooks. The Indian National Congress, according to him, therefore, at least the so-called moderates, not only accepted the view that the West was superior to the East. Yesterday also we had some interesting session where Prafula also said that's the only time that Indians perhaps failed with any colonial encounter was that we were made our mind that the West was superior to the East. But also made a clarion call to fellow Indians that they should discard their own civilization and assume another. This is to suggest that these English educated Hindus had altogether repudiated, or what he says, had learnt secretly to renounce the beliefs and customs of their forefathers. Thus, in the language of Panikkar, please listen to me a little more carefully, it's very interesting. I quote, the leaders of Indian national movement, particularly Indian National Congress, were Indian by birth, but they had renounced most of the things which their forefathers had cherished. These leaders, therefore, no longer had roots in their native soil. They were parasite upon the West. Their religion was the Spencer and Auguste Comte. Their philosophy was that of Jeremy Bentham and Mills, James Mill and John Stuart Mill, as Professor Kundan Singh was talking about yesterday. This is not the end of the story. Their philosophy, was I repeat, was that of Jeremy Bentham and the Mills. Their tradition was that of, very important, the tradition was that of Thomas Macaulay and Benjamin Jowett. They were uprooted culturally, unquote. So now it's almost concluding. I always would like to have an interaction with all of you. It is in this context, like Martin Luther of Germany sought to challenge the authority of Catholic clergy through his thought-provoking 95 Theses. My 8th thesis seek to question the credibility of those who challenge the polymath Panikkar's idea of integral Indian nationalism. My first thesis. Why do some scholars and Marxist historians in particular, who seek to analyze the history of nationalism in India, where culture, religion, and polity are intertwined, perhaps from its antiquity, trace its roots to political nationalism of Europe that emerged essentially after the two major revolutions, French Revolution and Industrial Revolution. This is not my hypothesis. The supposedly great modern European historian in the language of historian Romila Thapar. Second thesis, if the idea of nationalism is a 19th century construct, as often claimed by Marxist historians, thus this interpretation is really applicable to countries like India, where the idea of nation or nationalism is more cultural than material possession. My third thesis, when European countries hardly had any indigenous literature that support the existence of nationalism or patriotism, What has made those Eurocentric scholars to be apprehensive about integral Indian nationalism, as Panikkar visualizes, which is a fusion of religion and polity. Religion, I'm using here interchangeably, religion, culture, or spirituality. Fourth thesis: is it not a historical error then to assume that the origin of social and cultural phenomenon of nationalism is a Western product or imported into countries like India, as often Marxists claim? My fifth thesis: while Europe hardly had anything closer to nationalism before Industrial Revolution or French Revolution, as Eric Hobsbawm says, is it legitimate to presuppose that Indian mind was completely a stranger to the very conception of Indian mind or motherland and a corresponding sense of duties and obligations which the children of the motherland owe to her? My sixth thesis: are these Marxist historians influenced heavily by the Western notion of nationalism, answerable to their misrepresentation of facts, when the nationalist historians hope to form a coherent picture that might reflect the actual course of history differently? My seventh hypothesis, or thesis: why do Marxist historians therefore presuppose the idea of nationalism should always be political, the way West has projected? Why can't it be cultural or religious or spiritual or combination of all the three? A last thesis: should the European model alone be a model to be applied in India, where both politics and religion often help to fix the Indian minds, the consciousness of the possession of a common country to live and to serve, which is the primary and indispensable basis of what Panikkar would call an abiding, indivisible, and integral nationalism. Eagerly looking forward to have questions. Thank you.